Why you were placed in the avoidance life. You were not placed in the avoidance life by accident. You entered their world at a very specific psychological moment. Often, it was the moment they could no longer outrun intimacy without consequences. Your presence disrupted patterns they relied on to stay emotionally distant. You arrived not to save them, but to reveal something they had spent years avoiding. Avoidants do not meet people randomly. They subconsciously select partners who activate their deepest attachment wounds. You represented closeness without control, and that terrified them. You brought warmth where they relied on withdrawal. You offered emotional safety where they survived through distance. The avoidant felt something with you that they could not compartmentalize. That is why the connection felt intense, confusing, and unstable. You didn't chase them in the beginning. You didn't overwhelm them with need. You felt safe enough for them to approach and dangerous enough to awaken fear. You were placed in their life to confront their internal contradiction. They crave connection, but fear dependence. They want love, but distrust consistency. They desire closeness, but panic when it arrives. Your role was to bring that contradiction into the light. Avoidants often believe they are self-sufficient. They tell themselves they don't need anyone. Your presence quietly challenged that narrative. They felt seen without being consumed. That experience destabilized the identity they built around independence. You triggered what psychologists call attachment activation. This is the moment when emotional needs surface despite defensive strategies. Avoidants suppress these needs, not because they don't exist, but because they once hurt too much. You didn't create their fear. You exposed it. The reason they pulled away is the reason you mattered. Avoidants retreat when intimacy threatens their emotional armor. Distance is not indifference, it is regulation. Withdrawal is how they restore a sense of control. Your closeness disrupted that control. You were placed in their life to show them what genuine connection feels like. Not the fantasy of love, not the chase, not emotional chaos mistaken for chemistry, but calm presence with emotional availability. That kind of connection is unfamiliar to avoidance. Familiarity for them often feels unsafe. Consistency feels suspicious. Reliability feels like a trap. Your stability challenged their nervous system. Avoidance confused peace with boredom because chaos once kept them alert. You brought peace. Their body interpreted peace as danger, so they distanced themselves. Not because you lacked value, but because you exceeded their capacity. You were placed in their life to force awareness. Awareness of unmet emotional needs, awareness of suppressed grief, awareness of patterns they never questioned, awareness of how they disconnect to survive. Many avoidants are emotionally intelligent, but emotionally guarded. They can analyze feelings without fully feeling them. You bypass their intellect and reach their nervous system. That is why logic failed them. That is why they couldn't explain their behavior. Your presence stirred emotions they could not regulate. Affection triggered vulnerability. Care triggered obligation. Love triggered fear of loss. So distance became the solution. You were placed in their life as a mirror. Not a mirror of who you are, but of who they are afraid to become. You reflected their capacity for intimacy. You reflected their fear of dependence. You reflected the cost of emotional avoidance. Avoidants often leave relationships before they are left. Control feels safer than surrender. Withdrawal feels safer than vulnerability. Silence feels safer than honesty. You challenge that instinct. Your role was never to convince them to stay. It was to show them what staying would require. Emotional presence, accountability, consistency, and that was overwhelming. You were placed in their life to break the fantasy that distance equals strength. True strength requires emotional risk. Avoidance equate independence with safety. You expose the loneliness beneath that belief. That realization is destabilizing. Avoidants don't fear love itself. They fear losing themselves inside it. They fear being needed. They fear being depended on. You represented all of that at once. Your calm didn't soothe them. It activated them. Because calm requires surrender, and surrender requires trust. Trust was once unsafe for them. You were placed in their life to test their emotional ceiling, and they hit it. Not because you were too much, but because they had limited emotional bandwidth. Their withdrawal was self-protection, not rejection. Avoidants often regret silently. They replay moments they never processed. They feel loss without language. They miss without reaching out. Your absence lingers longer than they admit. You were placed in their life to introduce emotional consequence. Avoidants are used to disconnecting without cost. With you, the loss felt real. The silence felt heavier. The emptiness was noticeable. That is why you still cross their mind. Not because they want to return, but because you represent an unresolved chapter, a version of themselves they avoided becoming, a choice they were afraid to make. Your presence forced them to confront timing, not the right time for healing, not the right time for vulnerability, not the right time for commitment. Avoidants often meet the right person at the wrong stage. You were placed in their life to highlight what they are not ready for. That clarity is painful. It produces confusion. It produces distancing. It produces silence. Avoidants often respect what they lose more than what they keep. Distance sharpens awareness. Absence creates reflection. Your leaving taught more than your staying ever could. That is not failure. You were placed in their life as a catalyst, not a destination. Catalysts initiate change without staying for the outcome. They transform systems quietly. They leave behind awareness, and they move on. Your job was never to heal them. Healing is an internal decision. Your job was to activate self-confrontation. Whether they accept it is beyond your control. Your presence did its work. Avoidance grows slowly, often privately, often painfully, often after loss. Your absence became part of that growth process. You were placed in their life to teach them what connection costs. It costs emotional honesty, it costs discomfort, it costs fear, and it costs courage. Avoidants fear courage more than pain. Pain is familiar. Courage demands change. You represented change, so they resisted. Your role was never about being chosen. It was about being significant. You changed how they experience closeness. You disrupted old narratives. You left an emotional imprint. And here's the truth most people miss. Not every connection is meant to last. Some are meant to awaken. Some are meant to challenge. Some are meant to end. You were placed in the avoidance life to awaken something dormant. Whether they nurture it or suppress it is their choice. But they cannot unknow what they felt with you. They cannot unsee what you reflected, and they cannot fully forget the version of themselves they touched with you. So if you're questioning your worth, stop. Your value was never defined by their capacity. You were not too much. You were simply more than they could hold. And sometimes that is the point of the meeting.